Recording in progress. I love that. Um, but we are welcoming Kim today to join us. Kim is a has a Ph.D. from the Harriet Tubman Department of Women and Gender Studies, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland. She uses she, her pronouns and has worked for more than 20 years as a gender inclusivity and racial justice coach, mentor, and educator across corporate, nonprofit, government, and education sectors. She's been researching the places, people, and politics of Calgary's sex industry since 2015 and offers a public walking tour during the summer months. I'm going to post a link to those to sign up to those tours because I think there's one happening this Sunday, which is super exciting. She is a professor of women and gender studies at Mount Royal University, and I can confirm, having been one of her students, that it's an amazing experience. And a white settler living uninvited in Calgary, in Canada's Treaty 7 territory. And I will post her Instagram as well as her website to those walking tours if people want to sign up. But I'm going to hand it over to Kim for now.
Oh, thanks so much, Eddie. That you're just lovely. I am going to try to share my screen, and of course, Eddie and I did have a tech session just before this, and all was working. And now, for some reason, I cannot exactly figure out how to get it to share what is a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm not quite sure if Eddie, if there's something you see at your end. And while we're sorting this, I also want to give just a content warning for a discussion of sexualized violence briefly, and also potentially, depending on the questions you have and the direction our conversation goes today, of anti-Indigenous racism. Um, and I also want to also echo some of what Eddie said in terms of this entire conversation around Calgary's historic sex industry is really rooted in particularly the stigma and the criminalization of the sex industry then and now-ish. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go, is really rooted in white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy, right? Otherwise known as settler colonialism. And I too am a white settler to this land, and so this is also part of this work that I do, including today, is kind of part of my trying to uphold my treaty responsibilities to the degree that it is possible. What do we got, Eddie? Any thoughts? Any ideas?
Um, I'm
Yeah.
trying to.
Let me see. I'm just gonna like, oh, that's weird. Yeah, all of that's just Zoom stuff. Let me just see if I hit share what will happen. I don't think it's gonna do anything because you're just seeing my desktop basically.
Yeah,
What if I do this? Can you
we
see
can
the
see
power?
that.
No,
Yep.
now? All right, perfect. Okay, so here we are. Strut that stroll, making visible Calgary's historic sex industry. And I'm also meant to tell you that this is SSHRC funded, so the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also from funding from Mount Royal University. So many generous folks have enabled this research. So here we go. Um, and I also should say too, before I like launch in, that my research and teaching interest, I'm a professor, and so they've they've always been guided by where I live, um, or more specifically about the stories told about where I live. And so a crucial story that I realized was missing from Calgary's understanding of itself. And when I say that, I think tourism Calgary, think all the things, festivals and like the 150th anniversary of Confederation, those kinds of stories. The story that's missing from our city's narrative about itself is that its premier tourist attraction, the Calgary Stampede, has been from its inception, from its early days, even as the Calgary Exhibition, which was in the 1890s, a sex tourist destination. And this is what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and how the Calgary Stampede dovetails with my research on Calgary's historic sex industry. So, from almost the moment, like I remember the first conversation I actually had with a student back in 2009 about this. I began hearing from my students at Mount Royal University that the Stampede is the locus around which Calgary's sex industry turns. And they told me that, and I'm not from Calgary, I'm not even from Canada, right? So, they told me that cisgender and trans women from all over Western Canada come to Calgary during the Stampede um, for for to engage in the sex industry to earn their university tuition for the coming year. Um, and I was sort of like, well, that's interesting. And I had never been to the Stampede. I had no idea what it was or anything at all. I had never heard of it. And so I was like, well, that's I wonder if I could corroborate these anecdotes with actual evidence. And that's kind of how all of this started back in 2009. So I just started researching the history of Calgary's consensual adult sex industry and especially how it intersects with the Calgary Stampede. So, Strut That Stroll, which is the title now of this work, this project that I'm doing, it documents the people and places and politics of Calgary's consensual adult sex industry roughly between the start of settlement in the 1870s and the end of World War II. Um, and I also want to just give a shout out to Hanako over there in the ship program at SafeLink who came up with this name. Such a brilliant name, and thank you, Hanako. You're a rock star. Um, and so the tour and the project itself asks three related questions. So these questions are, for what political purposes have sex workers been erased from the story tells about its origins, right? From the story our city tells about its origins. What have been the consequences of that erasure, and what might be able to be done to rectify it? Um, and so given these questions, I've got a few goals, right? So the first, I'm documenting the people, places, and politics of Calgary's early sex industry. This seems like a fairly straightforward process, but as with everything that involves sex workers who are largely women in the past, it is really hard to track down folks and these mostly women who were doing this work in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There's lots of reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if anybody's interested. So we're documenting the people and places and politics of Calgary's early sex industry. My second goal is I want to change this story, right? I want to talk about and make visible sex workers' economic, cultural, and social contributions. This is true today, even as it was true in the past. And so I'm really interested in sort of kind of making visible the importance of sex workers to Calgary's early settlement. And then the third thing I'm doing is I'm advocating, and I'm really trying to support harm reduction and decriminalization, which is what sex workers say they want here in Alberta and across Canada more broadly. Um, and this and so I want to bring you to 1881. Picture it, 1881, as I channel Sophia Petrillo from the Golden Girls. Calgary's population was comprised in those early days of entirely white settler men. Okay, so in 1881, this is a picture, and the east and west branches of the Canadian Pacific Railway connected through Calgary. And because of the railway workers and all the folks that it takes to build a town, it was predominantly white settler men, overwhelmingly. These folks included members of the Northwest Mounted Police, which of course were sent across Canada from Ottawa by John A. Macdonald to erect Fort Calgary on the banks of the Elbow and Bow Rivers. Then came the white settler ranchers and loggers, followed by the railmen who finally connected these east and west branches of the CPR in 1881 in Calgary. So then, after the transcontinental, I'm actually go back to the slide for a second. After the transcontinental railroad was completed, Then you had your miners and the construction workers and the quarrymen, right? Think of, you're building a town on the prairie. Like, what do you need, right? And then a decade or so later, then came machinists. So think like auto mechanics, right? Merchants, lawyers, doctors. And then, so for a total population of about 4,000 settlers in Calgary by 1900. Here's the kicker, though. It was estimated that only about 500 of those 4,000 settlers were women. Um, and research the world over demonstrates that wherever there are large groups of single men who are coming and going, um, they're unattached, they don't have their families with them, there's a thriving sex trade. Research the world over has shown that this happens. And research also indicates that, to use James Gray's terms, where there is booze, there are brothels, because those industries have historically supported each other. And so, as a settler colonial outpost that was established in the 1860s to explicitly facilitate the European settlement of the Canadian West, 19th century Calgary seems to have had all the conditions for a robust sex industry. So that's what I started looking for, right? I was like, where's my evidence? What can I do about this? And Alberta remains 120 years later, quite unique actually among the Canadian provinces because it's the locus of four heavily male dominated extractive industries. Logging, ranching, mining, and oil and gas. Okay, so this offers circumstances for a robust sex industry to develop and continue. First of all, Calgary is Alberta's largest city. It's the country's fourth largest metro area, and it's considered the man capital of Canada, even today. And despite the fact that just like last week, the annual rankings came out that ranked Calgary the fifth best place in the world to live, it's consistently ranked among the country's worst places to be a woman. And this is for a bunch of different reasons. I list some of them here, right? There's high rates of the feminization of poverty. So if we're talking poor people in Calgary, most of those people are women with their dependent children. Calgary has the third highest rates of domestic violence in Canada. There's a lack of access to healthcare, especially reproductive healthcare. There are very few women in positions of leadership in any sector, whether political or corporate or education. Um, it has the highest gender wage gap in Canada and also a huge, as a consequence, gender wealth gap. And it has the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And so, what's really interesting about all this, though, is that Calgary's only, 120 some odd years old, right? So this is a fairly new city. And Calgary was also home in the early to mid 20th century to some really robust feminist organizing. And so I'm always interested in like what actually happened there. Something went on, right? And so how did the important contributions of settler women, especially sex workers, get erased? I think there are lots of answers to that question, so we'll explore just a few of them, right? Um, and so what I've found is that there's actually been two kinds of erasure. There's been a discursive erasure and a literal erasure of the people and politics and places of Calgary's adult consensual sex industry. So as seems to have been done, Calgary's not unique here, as seems to have been done in most Canadian and American plain cities, the erasure of sex workers' contributions happened um, in a discursive way by being erased in favor of a more positive narrative, right? So Calgary like is now this major urban area. It's a cultural capital of Canada. It's the center of Canada's oil and gas industry, and in fact, one of the country's wealthiest cities. Well, it doesn't get that way overnight, right? There's effort to be made to take that picture, that city that you saw from 1881 that little settler colonial outpost and make it into this city that it is today. There's effort and narrative and a conversation that has to be had in order to convince settlers to come here. And part of it was really sort of sanitizing what was going on here, right? And so that's the discursive piece of this, is that literally the narrative shifted so that it wasn't the booze broads, or the booze and gambling capital of the Canadian West. It started to be this this sort of major metropolitan area, right? That it was safe for families. There's not the kerfuffle that goes on in those sort of Wild West spaces, right?
Speaking of Kim,
Yeah.
I think
Go.
this is a great time to ask one of the questions that have come in that says, would
Okay.
you have any information about around whether the labor around the railroad in Calgary was largely done by Chinese immigrants,
It was indeed, yes. Yep.
and how that kind of like fits into this conversation, or
Oh yeah.
particularly around the building of this outpost city?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'll come at it from my lens, which is the consensual adult sex industry, right? So, one of the sort of stories I tell on the tour has to, not story, but it's like I relay this thing that happened, was that the story of, or the evolution of Chinatown, where it is, and the East Village, which is where most of the sex industry was for a good long chunk of time, about 20, 30 years. They're quite connected, and not because, not for the reasons you might think, or for stereotypical reasons, but actually it was because a lot of the sex workers who owned and operated brothels in the East Village and across the river in Bridgeland used the Chinatown laundries, and different, the sort of laborers that, after the railroad was finished, right, and they had connected in 1881. A lot of the men stayed in Calgary, and so they opened restaurants and opened laundries and opened, different businesses. And so sex workers relied on those folks, to hire construction workers, to like repair the shingles on the roof, kind of thing, right? Or to send the laundry, to tune the piano, those sorts of things, because they were so stigmatized that they weren't necessarily able to hire white settlers to come in and do that work, so they had a really close cultural, social, and political relationship with the former railway workers, who were largely Chinese immigrants. There's so much more to say about that, and I'm happy to say more if folks want. So hopefully, Eddie, that, like, can I keep on going, do you think?
Yeah, I think that answered the
Okay.
question. And similarly, if other questions come in, folks can utilize the Q&A box and setting to send questions to me for me to ask him
Yeah,
throughout.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Please do. Yeah. Because I told Eddie, I do have some things to say, but I'm happy to change those things depending on what the interests of folks are. So one of the things that SafeLink asked me to do was just talk about kind of the intersection with the Stampede. And so that's kind of what I'm aiming for. But yeah, there's so much to say. Oh my gosh, I could go on forever and ever. So I'll be brief. I'll be careful. Um, and so part of that, like, discourse, right, the discursive erasure, like the sort of changing of the story, also involved reducing Calgary's early sex workers to jokes and wild stories. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. And those wild stories aren't necessarily bad, they're actually quite fun. But when that's all you hear, and you don't hear the other important pieces, then that's the discursive erasure, right? So the two that I'll tell you are, one comes later in our conversation today, but one is this woman named Diamond Dolly, who lived in Hillhurst, and she used to get dressed up in all of her finery because her name was Diamond Dolly. I don't even know to this day if we know what her actual name was, right? But she would get dressed in all her silks and feathers and jewelry, and she would hook up her horse and buggy and come across the river. And on a Thursday, Friday night, as all the factory workers were getting out of work, she would just take her horse and buggy, west to east, east to west, west to east, east to west, and just advertise and call out her clients by name. She'd be like, "Hey, Steve. Hey, Tim." And she was pretty notorious for doing that, and a very popular sex worker. Diamond Dolly was her name, and there's a great CBC podcast about her from a few years ago. I want to say 2018, 2019. You can probably look it up. It's super fun. Um, so the another sort of part of this discursive erasure was that contemporary sex workers, right? So folks today are depicted or discussed, say, in the media as sexual deviants, as criminals, as public health risks, and also legally, like officially in the laws of Canada currently, as victims in need of rescue. And sometimes that's true. Usually it is not. And I really encourage folks that if you want some more information about that piece of it, take Sex Work 102, which is a SafeLink training. Brilliant. And they talk in that training about the legal status as victims of sex workers here in Canada. Um, and then another piece of the discursive erasure is that today's consensual adult sex industry is basically ignored or invisible, right? So many people that I tell about my research, about this project, about the walking tour that I give, they have no idea that there are even still sex workers in Calgary. They're like, no. I'm like, yeah. And if they do know, they think that those sex workers have been trafficked, right? They confuse sex trafficking with sex work, and they are not the same thing. Um, so that's what I mean by the discursive erasure, right? That just the story has been changed to the point that sex workers are just not here anymore. And then the literal erasure is actually easier to understand in a way, and there's kind of more like tangible evidence for it, right? So the literal erasure has been done with the goal of urban renewal, and lots of Bennett years, like lots of quotation marks. So the strolls, right? So in other words, a stroll is a physical area in a city where street-based sex workers will sell their services by literally like just walking up and down the block, right? Standing on the street corner. So that would be a stroll. All the strolls in Calgary have been moved from the city center to its outskirts. So literally erasing sex workers from the downtown core, from the East Village, from Victoria Park, from Bridgeland. Another way in which the literal erasure has been accomplished has been that all of the buildings where sex workers used to live and work have been mostly torn down or renovated, right? Literally erasing them by tearing them down or renovating them. Think the Cecil Hotel gone. Think most of the houses in the East Village are gone. Like there's no that neighborhood is a totally different neighborhood visually now than it used to be. So they're just gone, right? Entire city blocks. These are the strolls, right? These are the historic strolls. They have been paved over to create parking lots and build high-rise apartment buildings. This is what has been happening in East Village. This is what's been happening in Victoria Park. So literally, the sex workers have been just erased from their historical spaces of work. And the consequence of all of this has been that the role of settler women in the founding of Calgary is essentially nowhere, right? Um, but here's the problem. So, in a growing city full of unattached white working class white settler men who had nothing to do, they had no families with them. They weren't allowed in most cases in those early days to have their families with them. Um, and they had nothing to do in their free time but gamble and drink. Sex workers contributed mightily to the new city's economic, cultural, and social development throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But we know nothing about them, right? And this is part of what my research and the walking tour is meant to rectify. So one of the things I do on the tour is I deploy local author Aritha Van Herk's understanding of Alberta's early white settlers as mavericks. And she, Aretha Van Herk, is a literature professor at the University of Calgary, and she wrote this book called Mavericks: An Incorrigible History of Alberta. It's one of my favorite books. And she describes in this book Mavericks as a unique character, an inspired or determined risk taker, forward looking, creative, leader for change, someone who propels Alberta in a new direction or who alters the social, cultural, or political landscape. Now we think about Mavericks as the big four, right? The founders of the Calgary Stampede. We think about Mavericks as maybe the early chief of police, right? We think about the Mavericks who were the early Northwest Mounted Police officers who settled Fort Calgary, right? Those kinds of folks. But I encourage tour goers and really anyone I talk to, to question this celebratory designation by remembering that Alberta's conventional mavericks, right, the fur traders and the railway workers and the coal miners and the loggers, the Northwest Mounted Police officers, the CPS officers, the businessmen, the ranchers, the lawyers, the doctors, and later the oil and gas guys, they were not only the primary instruments of Canada's settler colonial project and the settling of Calgary, but they were also the clients of Calgary sex workers. Because you cannot have a sex industry without demand. It doesn't work, right? Um, and so it follows then that it's really quite unfair to focus only and usually negatively on the sex workers, the suppliers of sexualized services, without also considering the crucial role of their clients, who were, by the way, mavericks, right? The mavericks that Aretha Van Herk talks about. And so I try to remind folks to think about this new way of understanding Calgary's settler colonial history because it documents a more accurate narrative, but also helps to reduce the stigma and negative stereotypes of contemporary sex workers, right? And also, the past really does help to explain the present in terms of the very terrible status of women in Alberta and in Calgary. Um, and the high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So I want to use the CS as an example. So I argue in my tour and in other places that the Calgary Stampede has always been and remains a sex tourist destination. Sex tourism, very briefly, is a highly lucrative and growing sector of the tourism industry in which a primary purpose for travel is to engage in sex and sex related activities. Okay. Um, Sex tourism happens all over the world. It's pretty common. I could name some places: Russia, Thailand. Most of Southeast Asia is really famous for sex tourism. There are reasons why sex tourism exists, and often it is officially sanctioned, actually. But I don't want to kind of go down that rabbit hole. And I'm not arguing that sex tourism is officially sanctioned in Calgary or by the Calgary Stampede. That is not what I'm arguing. What I am arguing is that people are coming to the Calgary Stampede, to Calgary, specifically to engage in sex and sex related activities as clients. Um, and I just want to pause for like a quick public service announcement. Like, think of this as parentheses. First of all, sex tourism is not necessarily exploitative. It's not necessarily abusive. So that's the first thing. The second thing is sex tourism doesn't necessarily have anything to do with sex trafficking because the existence of a sex industry does not necessarily indicate that those folks working in that industry have been trafficked. They're two separate things. Um, and then the third thing I think to say about sex tourism is that there's actually little evidence, there's myths about this, but there's little evidence that sex trafficking increases during big events like the Stampede. Okay, so this is where the conflation of like sex trafficking, sex work, and sex tourism, I'm trying to like break that up a little bit. Um, my students have told me, and I've observed in my own research, it does seem to be the case that the numbers of sex workers working in Calgary increases during the Calgary Stampede, but that does not signal an increase or even the existence of sex trafficking. Okay, so that's two separate things, and it can potentially be confusing, but I just want to like put that out there, and maybe Eddie, you can help us sort that out later. And then the fourth thing I want to say, just kind of as a public service announcement about sex tourism, is there's nothing inherently wrong with like adults engaging in consensual sexual activities. I mean, I'm gonna attest to the fact that sex between consenting adults is actually can be quite lovely and fun. Um, and there's also nothing wrong with having boatloads of fun by either buying or selling sexual services during the Calgary Stampede. Although both aspects of those things are still illegal in Canada. But the point at which my feminist warning bells begin to clang is when the fun seems to benefit like a few select few at the expense of most of the rest of us. And that's kind of where my public service announcement ends. And I want to get back to our original programming, which is thinking about how the Calgary Stampede serves as a sex tourist destination and what's my evidence for that, right? So I'm going to offer you one piece of evidence during my talk, and that is a sex worker whose name was Pearl Miller. And this is her mugshot from 1941. She is just she's wild, this woman. She's one of the folks that there's a lot of wild stories about her. Most she was sort of Calgary's most famous and longest working sex worker. So, like for example, there's a rumor that when Canadian soldiers were over in Europe during World War II, and American soldiers would say, "Remember Pearl Harbor," as kind of like a morale boost. And I know you're tired, and I know that you're away from home, and I know this is a terrible situation, but remember Pearl Harbor, remember what we're fighting for. The Canadian soldiers would say, "Oh, forget Pearl Harbor, remember Pearl Miller." That's apparently how famous she was and how very good at her job. And so this is her CPS mugshot, likely from the last time she was arrested in 1941. So I want to show you my favorite parking lot in Calgary, keeping in mind I'm still sort of talking about this intersection between the sex industry and the Calgary Stampede, and the Calgary Stampede is a sex tourist destination. So this is my favorite parking lot. It is at 526 9th Avenue Southeast. It's a great example of the ways in which there's been a literal erasure of Calgary's sex industry, because this is probably, near as I can figure, the former site of Pearl Miller's house. And so I just want to show you where we are in the city, where my favorite parking lot is. This is on 9th Avenue Southeast. It is right here. This is the little X. And you can see, let me see, where can I show you? McLeod Trail is on the left here. And then you can see where City Center would go to the left. And then the Elbow River is on the right. The Bow River is on the north here, the northeast. You can see the Confluence Historic Site and Parkland, otherwise known as Fort Calgary, in its former name. So you can see kind of where my favorite parking lot is in the city. And I just want to go back and show you. So that's what it looks like today. And then that's where it is in the city on a contemporary map. And then here's what it looked like in 1923. The caption for this picture, you can see it up in the upper left, is "Horse-drawn coach in Calgary Exhibition and Stampede Parade 1923. Photo is courtesy of the Glenbow Archives." Glenbow Archives has just amazing stuff. It's one of my favorite places in our city. And so I want to just go back to our map and point out that the geographical proximity of Pearl Miller's home on 9th Avenue Southeast, which used to be known as Whiskey Row, this whole stretch, this is the East Village, this whole stretch between McLeod Trail Southeast and the Elbow River used to be known as Whiskey Row, 9th Avenue Southeast. And the proximity of her home, the location of her home here and its proximity to the Calgary Stampede is not a coincidence. She was a very smart person and she knew exactly what she was doing when she bought her house there. Um, and so I want to also point out on this map that this is where the CPR rail yard is, right across the street from Pearl Miller's house, right? So you've got Pearl Miller's house, the CPR Railway, and then the Calgary Stampede grounds. And I want to tell you just a few kind of funny stories about Pearl Miller. So Pearl Miller was under long-time surveillance by the Calgary Police Service over the course of many years, um, by foot patrol as well as from a boxcar at the CPR rail yard across the street from her house, right? So you can see, Eddie, give me a shout. Can you see my cursor as I'm like kind of kind of showing you where I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yay. Yay for us. Yay technology. And so she was being very much observed by the Calgary Police Service. And one of my favorite stories about Pearl Miller is that um, there were a couple of constables who had been assigned to sit in a boxcar in the rail yard across the street from her house one night. And it was apparently quite cold that night. You know, it was like the 1930s and there was no, Tim Hortons. And so they're trying to keep warm, they're trying to stay awake, they're trying to observe what's going on, because, of course, the selling of sex was illegal at that time in Canada, and so these two constables, nobody bothered to tell anybody in the CPR rail yard that they were there. They were supposed to be doing like this underground secret surveillance of Pearl Miller's house, and they didn't tell anybody. The CPS didn't tell anybody that they had put a couple constables in a boxcar that night, and so the constables fell asleep because it's cold and it's winter and it's dark and cold and there's no coffee, um and they accidentally, the boxcar that they were in accidentally got connected to a locomotive engine, and they woke up in Ogden, which of course is, that way, right? So if this is the rail line, it goes that way. And for us now, Ogden, the Ogden Yard is like if you're traveling on Blackfoot Trail, and you're kind of you're going a little north, and like the Inglewood is on your left. Ogden is like on the right. It's by where the Calgary Humane Society is, the animal shelter, right? Um, I lied. There's two separate animal shelters. It's not the Humane Society. It's the City of Calgary Animal Shelter. It's over there. The Ogden Yard is over there. So for us now, it doesn't seem too far away. It's like, it's a car. Who cares? Well, in 1930s, these two guys, they had to walk back into town, right? So they had to like walk back from all the way from Ogden back into town to get back to headquarters over here. And that, I always joke on my tour, that is a super duper walk of shame, especially because they weren't, fruitful in any of their surveillance efforts for a really, really long time. So that's what makes me laugh about that one. Um, and then the other story that is my favorite thing about Pearl Miller is, and when you like, as a researcher, when I am able to find something like this in the archives, it makes me so happy. So I just want to like pause. I'm gonna let you read and absorb what it is you're looking at right now, and I'm gonna have a little beverage. So essentially, what this is a police department memo from the Office of the Chief Constable, whose name was Detective Ritchie, and it was dated July 11th, 1939. It was a memorandum to a Detective G. Gilbert, instructing him to pay particular attention to Pearl Miller's home during that week. And that week happened to be Stampede Week 1939. And I swear I'm just like giddy. Every time I talk about this, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that is just a brilliant piece of archival evidence, of just enormous proportion, and sort of it demonstrates so many things, not least of which is the connection between the adult consensual sex industry and the Calgary Stampede. But also, and this is just one piece of evidence, but also it is evidence of the ways in which sex workers like Pearl Miller were able to basically just evade the police for so many years. There are very particular reasons why that happened over the course of about 30 years for Pearl Miller and longer for some other folks, in terms of There were moments in Calgary's history where the CPS cared that there was a sex industry, and there were moments in Calgary history where the CPS didn't care that there was a sex industry. And those moments depended on what was happening socially and politically and culturally, and like who was the chief of police and those kinds of things. But in this moment, in the late 1930s, the CPS cared that there was a sex industry, and Pearl Miller managed to kind of evade it for quite a long time. So it's super interesting to think about how that happened and how she managed to do that. So very fun thing. So now let me talk a little bit about the effects of all this, right? I call them stampede effects. So back in 2010 was the first time I attended the Calgary Stampede, and my first impression of that event was that it did actually seem to have many of the ingredients, let us say, to be wildly popular with folks that are looking for and or offering casual hookups. Um, First, it's an established popular tourist event. It's a celebration of conventional heteronormative gender roles. There's a lot of heavy drinking. And there's lots of people, particularly men, cisgender white settler men, with a whole lot of money to burn and in search of novel recreation and entertainment, and also a temporary carnivalesque atmosphere. And so this is one of the kind of effects of the Calgary Stampede in our city, is that the increased alcohol use creates this carnivalesque atmosphere that encourages atypical, even eccentric behavior. So like, this behavior kind of gets legitimized precisely because the opportunity to behave in those kinds of ways is so fleeting, is so rare. Um, and development studies scholars have, and this is the second stampede effect that I want to kind of talk about today. Development studies scholars all over the world have increasingly pointed to tourism as a key catalyst in the global sex industry. Again, not necessarily sex trafficking, just the global sex industry broadly. And scholars that work at the intersection of development studies and critical tourism studies have demonstrated time and time again that the atmosphere that's generated around events like the Calgary Stampede often contributes to the reification of rape culture. And the very short definition of rape culture is just that sexualized violence is normalized and then victims are blamed for their assault, right? And this dramatically increases rates of gender-based violence. Places like the Center for Sexuality have actually been talking about this for a lot of years, like at least as long as I've lived in Calgary, and probably before that. And then the third sort of stampede effect is that, we all know, right, that there's a general recognition on the streets of Calgary that the annual Stampede is just this 10-day excuse for like booze-fueled, reckless, and extravagant revelry. I kind of joke it's like a hedonistic hootenanny, you know. Um, and according to like Yelp.com, for example, um, one of the folks back in 2011 called the annual Stampede a wild Western orgy disguised as a rodeo. And there's so much more evidence around the party atmosphere that gets generated during this event. But essentially, because of the increased alcohol use, because of the normalization of rape culture, what ends up happening is there's a lot of risky behavior that goes on. So there's, a lot of there's a lack of safer sex practices leads to every year an increase in unwanted pregnancies, an increase in STI testing, an increase in STI positive results. Um, and this is all like documented quantitatively. I'm not going to bother sort of going through all of my evidence here. We all know it happens. It's just sort of the evidence of it, right? And so because of all this, right, it's like a telltale sign that a whole huge chunk of the cowboys and cowgirls who are playing fast and loose during Stampede Week are not doing it safely. Um, and back in 2007, one news story called Stampede season Calgary's unofficial season of STIs. Um, so The other thing I want to say too is that there's the other quantitative evidence is that divorce lawyers every year also report increase in business in the weeks and months following the Calgary Stampede, because as the Stampede cliche goes, it's not cheating, it's stampeding. And this is one of my favorite pictures. I'm gonna come to it. This is my favorite picture. My partner and I one day during Stampede, we were driving over in Hillhurst, and I think I was the one driving actually. I don't remember, but they saw this. They saw this out the corner of their eye. They're like, Kim, oh my gosh, look at that sign. And so I jumped out the car and took a picture of this florist sign it was just sort of outside. It was like one of those tent signs outside the shop in Hillhurst. Um, I could drive by it today if I wanted to, this florist shop. But yeah, so right, 2 aspirin and an alibi with every purchase. So this sign, so interestingly, presumably trades on the stereotype of a man buying flowers for his wife or girlfriend to atone for his stampede related sins, right? But what's super interesting is like after stampeding hard, this florist's customer is also going to need a couple aspirin to get rid of his hangover, as well as an alibi to cover up where he's been, what he's been doing, and with whom, right? So I want to just like zoom back out again and come back to the purpose of this project. So the whole idea about my project, about the walking tour, is that I'm documenting the people and places and politics of Calgary's consensual adult sex industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the sort of first, 50 some odd years of settler colonial Calgary. Um, and more broadly, I'm really interested in arguing for a new way of understanding the settler colonial history of our city. So I'm trying to carve out a space in this historical narrative for the women who helped build Calgary, especially sex workers who are so stigmatized and made fun of or not talked about at all, right? I'm trying to reduce the stigma and negative stereotypes of contemporary sex workers by basically sort of talking about the importance of sex workers in the past to the city that we know today, and then realizing that like those folks are still doing the same kind of work, right? They're still serving the same kind of purpose in our city, economic, cultural, social, right? One of the really important tasks, responsibilities that sex workers had in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was just entertaining all these guys that were in off the prairie or that were in from Ottawa, because there was nothing else for them to do. And a lot of that is still going on. Um, and then the third thing is, I'm really just trying to provide a context to explain why it is that Alberta has such a terrible gender wage gap, for example, why it is that Alberta has the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, why it is that Calgary consistently ranks among the worst places in Canada for women to live. And so I'll talk just a little bit about the walking tour itself, right? So we start from the famous 5 monuments in Olympic Plaza, and then basically go a 3 kilometer circular route to all these relevant sites in Calgary's downtown core, also along the banks of the Bow River, through the East Village, and then we end up almost back to where we started, about a block from City Hall, and we pass by the Simmons Building, we pass by the Hotel Eddie, we go under Reconciliation Bridge. We go through the Victoria. We go through the East Village, which is where this little house here on the bottom. Folks who are familiar with the East Village may remember this house got recently torn down. I think it got torn down just before COVID, like 2018, 2019. I think I probably have one of the last photos of this house actually in the East Village. Um, and so the last thing I want to talk about is just what's next, right? So if you're interested in kind of like where to find the tour or what might be going on with my research, I've got a couple research assistants this summer who are awesome, and we're working on putting together a printed map. So it'll be like an illustrated map of the walking tour routes, and hopefully that will be for sale in local bookstores by the fall. And then we're also putting together a website. So all of my research and everything will be curated and collected and collated, and it will be an open access digital public history place to find all the things I'm talking about here and even some more stuff. And then if you want to learn more, register for SafeLink trainings. They didn't put me up to this. I promise they're awesome trainings. Eddie gives a great training, and SafeLink just has such useful stuff, particularly around the sex industry, but harm reduction generally, substance use, just all kinds of really cool stuff. And then you can join me on the walking tour. Just find me on Eventbrite, super easy to find. And then the last thing you can do is support the Shift program at SafeLink, and there's the place to donate right there on the website. Right there, yippee skippy. So that's me, and that's how you can find me. So thank you all so much for this opportunity, and I am happy to answer whatever questions have shown up in the chat to Eddie, or we can open it up. I'm not sure what you want to do, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll just go from there.
There is a couple questions in the chat that I want to send your
Sure,
way.
do it.
Lots of amazing folks sharing stories and agreeing with everything you have to say. Um, Lots of thank yous. We have one question that says, I know it's likely difficult because of the stigma of sex work and the intersections of race and gender identity and the privilege of white cisgender women in particular in sex work to be able to be more face out and open about their involvement in the industry.
Yep.
But do you know of any historical sex workers of color or queer sex workers, either local to Calgary or even just in Canada in general?
Uh, I Let me start backwards. The short answer is yes, and I'll come there in a minute. The where I want to start is I am not familiar with a broad scope, right? My focus is really Calgary, and so, but on my website I do have, and I will have more of as we build the website. Um, I do have resources for Canadian sex industry, and so there may be folks that you could ask that question of in terms of BIPOC sex workers, queer sex workers, trans sex workers across Canada who are famous. I mean, for example, I do know that folks leading the charge to change some of the laws right now are largely BIPOC and largely queer, right? So there's that. I do know. I just don't know. I don't have names, right? Now, and also my research is historical, so it's really Calgary, it's really history. So now let me answer your question. In terms of my focus, the late 19th, early 20th century in Calgary, I do not know of any queer sex workers. I do know were they there? Yes, of course they were. Were they out? Yeah. Um, and I want to come back to how I know about some sex workers in a second, right? Because it gets tricky, as you point out. Um, I do know of two BIPOC sex workers. And I talk about both of them on my tour, actually. One of the BIPOC sex workers is an Indigenous woman named Rosalie Newgrass, and I talk about her on the tour. And another is a woman named Helene Hubert, who was of African American descent. And I talk about her on the tour. So her establishment was in the Nose Creek area, which is just behind the Telus Spark Center. And Rosalie Newgrass was working in the East Village and the downtown core. So I talk about both of those women on my tour. Now, let me sort of step back and actually answer a question that wasn't asked but implied. Oh, it is so hard to know who was a sex worker and who wasn't a sex worker. And and there are so many reasons for this, but I think I'll start by saying um, then as now, I only know who sex workers are because they encountered the justice system, right? Most sex workers, I will never know who they were because they didn't get arrested. They, they did their work and they kept on keeping on. There is one sex worker that I talk about on my tour who did not encounter the justice system, at least she was never arrested. She did encounter the justice system, but only because her clients were the chief of police. But she was never, oh yeah, she's fun. But she was never, she wasn't ever arrested, right? So she had no criminal record that I know of, but she's the only one. Everybody, and the only reason I know about her is because she could write. She was literate, and so she wrote letters. She wrote her diary, right? The other sex workers, like I only know about them because they were arrested. and often not for prostitution, which would have been the charge, but they were arrested for vagrancy, because they were walking someplace without the company of a man. They were behaving in a way that the arresting officer didn't like and thought women shouldn't behave, right? There was no actual evidence of them being sex workers or having engaged in prostitution, or operating a common bawdy house, lots of quotation marks, right? But they were just where the arresting officer thought they shouldn't be at the time, doing something that the arresting officer thought they shouldn't be doing at the time. So that's vagrancy. And interestingly, this is also where Chinatown comes into play in our conversation, because I do tell a, a story of a sex worker whose name was Effie Brady. No, I lied, Della English, who was coming home from Chinatown one night. She was walking from Chinatown to the East Village one night in 1910, and she was arrested for vagrancy. And the arresting officer thought she should not. She was a white settler woman, and she should not be walking from Chinatown. Why was she consorting with those Chinese folks, right? So racism, sexism, misogyny, all part of this conversation about the white supremacist, capitalist, cis, heteropatriarchal, stigmatization of the sex industry, criminalization of the sex industry in Calgary, despite the fact that sex workers were key to the creation of the city that we know today as Calgary.
And I think that brings up a really, when we have limited options for tracking or finding history, in addition to the language shifts that we have in that, what we talk about often in Sex Work 101 is the difference between sex work and sex trafficking,
Mm.
and sex tourism as a whole, in terms of um, and in terms of redefining and clarifying the differences between these things.
Yeah,
And that is so difficult when we're looking into history because the continuum of consent is already something that people, especially the law, struggles with. And so when we're looking at history, and especially the media, I think so often these days media is conflating sex trafficking with sex work, and I
yeah,
think that happens in particular around Stampede.
it does.
um, and as you mentioned, I think previously, um, when we're talking about like if there actually are reports of like increased patterns during Stampede, and what that looks like um, when it's conflated in the media too, as
Exactly.
like, of course a big event is going to pull people in, just like any
Mhm.
just like any industry. Many people will flock to Calgary to do work during Stampede as part of like the increase in population, and so many sex workers, independent or otherwise, will come to Calgary because the business is going to be good.
Exactly.
um, and we know lots of shift clients are like, peace out and go on vacation during
Yep.
Stampede, just like many of us do.
Exactly.
And so this media conflation of trafficking and sex work, how do you manage the like, I think the language in particular with looking into history,
Yeah.
and like how confusing it and how hard it might be to actually be able to trace and track that.
Yeah, I love that question. And it's been super tricky. And this is why this project's kind of ongoing. I don't think I'll ever be finished because there's always something like that shows up, right? So one of the sort of um kind of clearest examples, uh oh gosh, my brain is just going in so many directions. One of the
I
clearest
know.
examples is like, so sexual violence, so rape was called an outrage in the night in 19th century letters, diaries, right? When if women wrote about what happened to them, and I want to actually come back to this in a second. Something is coming. I want to write myself a note. Sex violence. Um, if women wrote about what happened to them, they would call it outrage. And so, so assuming these, I mean, have the records been digitized? Can you search for the term? all of the answers are probably no, right? Depending on what we're talking about. I mean, it's wild. And then one of the things I just wrote down to myself is that um, on my tour, the one of the stereotypes, and Eddie, I know you teach about this in the Sex Work 101, 102, and 103 series. One of the sort of stereotypes is that, oh, sex work is inherently dangerous, right? Sex work is inherently a violent thing. And interestingly, the research that I have done, there's very little evidence that sex workers found their work dangerous. I talk in two places about sexualized violence against sex workers, one of which was a CPS officer who raped the person he arrested for vagrancy. Um, and the second was Calgary's first murder victim who was killed by her client. Um, but otherwise, and her client was a white settler cis man who was a very wealthy, prominent person in our community in the 1880s. Um, right. But otherwise, I haven't found a whole lot of evidence that there was any kind of danger. It was just the work that they were doing. It was just their work, right? Um, and so I wanted to sort of stop there and say, like, I don't want folks to leave here thinking, oh my gosh, like the Stampede and sex work and sex tourism and sexualized violence, like they're actually very kind of separate things. They intersect, but they're not necessarily mutually constitutive, if that makes sense, right? They don't depend on each other. Um, so and other something else I'll say about language too, right, is that I've got a couple RAs this semester who are amazing and brilliant this summer, and they're doing a bunch of research for me, and this has been sort of the case when I've had RAs in other times as well, right, that we're in archives or we're doing work in the databases or whatever it is we're doing, and like we have to always be quite conscious of our search terms, because like I want to, here we want to be respectful and we want to say sex workers this and sex work that and clients this and clients that. But actually, we have to be thinking prostitution. We have to be thinking Johns. We have to be thinking what were the words in the moment that we're talking about, right? Like how would the media in 1894 have talked about the CPS arresting a sex worker or arresting a bunch of sex workers in a bawdy house, right? Or doing a raid on a brothel. Like, it's like you have to always be thinking about how to look for what it is you're wanting to find. The other thing that gets really tricky is that not only were these folks largely women, who and women's history already is not documented properly for all kinds of reasons. Women are not considered important. They change the last name, so they're hard to track, right? Because you change your name when you get married. Um, and they also weren't allowed to own property or have their own like existence for a really long time. This was the law. It was the British North America Act, and it was the law, British common law. And so they're really hard to keep track of. And then, of course, being a sex worker, you weren't going to just go out and be like, yay, everybody, I'm a sex worker. Look at me. That's what I do for a living. Or even if you did it partially for a living, right? So as today, lots of folks who were sex workers in the time that I'm researching were, they would do sex work on the weekends and then were tailors during the week and sewed the uniforms for the RCMP and for the Calgary Police Service and had pretty exclusive contracts, which also made them incredibly valuable socially and culturally because they had contacts, they had clients at all echelons of society. So they absolutely knew what was going on, which is part of why the CPS didn't care that much that the sex industry existed for most of the chunk of time that I'm talking about. It was only towards the end that they started to care a lot.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I know, folks, that we've kind of gone over our 1-hour mark. It's impossible not to when conversation is so
I'm
good.
sorry. I talked a lot.
No, no, we love it, and I do wanna invite folks, if need be, to kind of duck out as they need to. There is one more question that I want to make sure is asked. And I also want folks to know that we have that I sent the link in the chat to most of, I tried to send links to most of the things that we chatted about. In particular, Kim's book,
Oh,
which
cheers.
is
Thank you.
about Stampede and misogyny, white supremacy, and settler colonization. And I think it is one of those other amazing resources when it comes to this like evidence that you've compiled, and how often academic um, evidence is is important and plays an important role next to the lived experience that we have with the shift program. So please do check out the shift program at safelinkalberta.ca. I put the website in the chat as well. I'm also going to throw the link to a survey into the chat if folks have the option to do, if folks have the ability to do a quick survey. That would really help us in being able to continue to offer free trainings, if I can find it ever. Um, Otherwise, I want to pass on this other question that we got. That in particular, thanked you for the presentation and really said they learned so much and that they did take the walk and highly recommended it.
Oh, yay.
Um, and they also mention, or they also ask if you have encountered any pushback from people wanting to discredit or hide this evidence, and what
Yeah,
that
of
looks like.
course.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh, the Stampede hates me. They wish I would go away. Yeah. And I, I think that's actually probably too strong. They just ignore me. This like they have a copy of my book. They just ignore me, which is fun. Yeah, and folks like I think I get the most pushback on folks that want me to unpack the difference between sex trafficking and sex work, right? Well, how is it that sex work is not the same as sex trafficking? Aren't all sex workers trafficked? And and if I go down that rabbit hole, then I don't get to tell you all the awesome stuff about how sex workers are fabulous, right? And so important to the city we know today in so many ways, economically, politically, socially, culturally. Um, and so that's the biggest pushback I get. But once I sort of say there's a difference, uh there's trainings you can take, there's books you can read, there's things that and I point them in the resources direction, they tend to be okay. As for like most of the pushback, I think is just the silencing, it's just the sort of ignoring that this research is being done, that this project exists, and I'm okay with that. I'm kind of used to being ignored, you know. I feel like the people who need the information or want the information will find the information, kind of thing. So, yeah.
for sure. I understand um, the radical acceptance of being on some shit lists
Yeah.
um, and what that's like. But um, lastly, I just want to thank Kim so much for coming and chatting with us today
Oh,
and
cheers.
talking
Thanks for the opportunity.
about your research and about all the things that you do. We have some people that are asking if they can come to the walking tour on Sunday without potentially registering online or if they need to RSVP.
It would be best to RSVP because I only let about 15 people at a time on, because I find that it gets too big otherwise, and I can't do the personalized tour and answer everybody's questions that I like to do. So yeah, it's best to register. And plus, what we haven't mentioned, oh my God, Eddie, duh, is that all of the donations that I collect for the walking tour go directly to the Shift program to support basic needs, supporting sex workers, harm reduction stuff. So that's also why I like folks to register, because then you can just like send your donation through Eventbrite, and then I can send it right to Shift, and it just like it avoids cash on site. You know what I'm saying? And it's just easier for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you. Um, if there are other questions that pop up for folks, please do feel free as well to email the education at safelinkalberta.ca email, and we can get back to you with any of the information if you missed some of the links today. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kim, for coming
Thank you.
and chatting. Um, and and we look forward to continued conversation. People can also look forward um, to the recorded version of this being up to be able to see. Um, and as well, you can check out our page for where testing clinics or other resources will be around the city during Stampede. Our outreach team will be walking up and down 17th Ave tomorrow, as well as near the Stampede grounds during the next couple of weeks. So you can look for the bright yellow backpacks and the SafeLink hats. And otherwise, we're here. Please cap your cowboy, folks. We're trying to limit the spread of STBBIs during Stampede. So feel free to come pick up some condoms or check out where your closest testing clinic is. And otherwise, we hope you have a safe Stampede. I'll leave it at safe. And otherwise, we will be signing off for the day. Bye, folks.